if I have a look at optimizing or getting the most out what's already built, which from a UK standpoint, that's largely done. And if you go around Europe, you know, there's minimal additional new capacity being added other than, you know, auctions or tenders in France or Germany or whatever that's kind of like, you know, smaller amounts and predetermined. So my question comes back more to optimizing and getting the most out of what's already owned. And one of the things there, and again, I guess Aldo, you touched on this the most, is having confidence in what you're buying is fully optimized. The O&M is fully optimized. The monitoring is fully optimized. Are there? I mean, Aldo, you touched on it, so I'm going to give you the first one on this. And you know, if because you know, if I go through, you know, all your companies, then you're basically, by the time you get in and you're adding assets, literally the site's either someone else has decided the components, the EPC. I mean, sometimes you can get in early enough and you can drive component selection, but a lot of the times it's seeing what else is out there. And you know, how do you know, or do you basically acquire sites and then it's like, okay, so how many companies there are still around? Are they bankrupt? Are they, you know, how much of that's an issue, and how do you change that?
Just to give an introduction to the problem, I personally spend most of my time talking to investors and raising capital. So I put up my face in front of these people and tell them a lot of beautiful things about solar. Most of them I believe in, but then I have the goosebumps when I find that some of them are a bit difficult to demonstrate. And so I'm really keen to maintain my reputation. Usually when I put up a ties, because I go out there and raise capital, the kids usually in the morning when they see me with the ties, they're like, oh, Daddy, you are going for asking for more money now. So today they told me the same thing. They say, no, they are not asking for money. But the issue is that I always say that this technology can last for 30, 40 years, and that there is demonstrable history that these panels perform that long. Now, the issue is that this demonstrable issue is based on very few case studies, because the majority of the capacity was installed now 10 years ago. Now, I look at what was installed 10 years ago, and some of them are actually falling down in pieces. You know, what was this issue about the backsheet, the lamination that we started to see on some assets built 8, 9 years ago in Italy? That's terrible. It's dreadful. This industry does not need that. The only thing that is maintaining this industry is just the promise that this technology is very simple, doesn't do anything for 25 years, and it works perfectly, you know, with this degradation in line. Nobody has ever believed, I'll give you this word of wisdom, nobody has ever believed in the guarantees and for any panel manufacturers being there in 20 years' time. But the belief from investors was the technology is actually sound. But if technology falls into pieces, this is really bad. And so for now, I think we have found only few instances of issues of this type. And going forward, for example, the care that we have started to apply in the last few years was go and select the batch of panels that we're going to install on our assets, trying to follow those panels up as much as possible in the production chain, because we have found actually that there is a big difference in large manufacturers in a batch versus another one. And so thanks to sort of this kind of technical insight, we actually pick the batches of products that we are installing in our assets, and we want to see just the best one in our assets. But this is painful, and it doesn't do good in any way to the rest of the industry if the other batches actually go to another investor who hasn't done the check and their assets fall into pieces. Because then the story spreads around and investors all of a sudden say, oh, solar, no, that's terrible. It's the kind of thing that I have in my garden and it never works and it falls into pieces. So it doesn't work in any way. So that's, I think, what we need to do.
If you see the component selection and the quality control that's done by the EPCs and the selection, then they'll subcontract out somebody to fly over to China to do, an inspection of a factory. They come back and say it's all great, and it's, anybody can do that. And then you see the selection of components and the checks down through the value chain, because literally everything is outsourced and third-party outsourced. So, even if you get a panel or an inverter, then, you can toss a coin if they actually made it. And then this all goes together, and normally goes together very quickly by EPCs that are rushing to do things very quickly in kind of, quick cycles. And then all of a sudden someone comes in and buys it. And then so it's actually, I've always thought that it's actually that whole quality control side has to come down from the people that end up owning the site. It's not from the module suppliers bottom up that say everything's great, the backsheet suppliers that say, yeah, we have to, DuPont's better than, whoever. It's that's that, because the asset owners are the ones that see it, over 20 years. The rest of them all, got the money, it's in the bank, and they've moved on to a different country, or they've gone bankrupt, or they've moved into a different sector. They're in it just quickly to get that sell. And right now, they're the ones that are kind of driving that whole, what's the certification needed, who's doing the quality control, what are the parameters, and there's absolutely zero standardization in that regard. So, somebody will say, oh, are you on the Bloomberg Tier 1 list? Great, you must be good. And if that is if that's what determines the quality of the components, then it's no surprise that it's a total lottery that what's coming on site. Again, Federico, in terms of Italy's got a little bit more, longer experience in solar than the UK. So some of the stuff that was built there will go back 10 plus years.
Adding to what Aldo was saying, I agree with him, but there's also another element that needs to be taken into account. And you're right in saying that due to the fact that we had Conto Energia very quickly changing, the plants have been built very fast, and they've been built by some EPC contractors that then disappeared, who did the O&M for the first 2, 3, 4 years at prices imposed by banks, which were ludicrous. And you were paying, I had a plant for which I had to pay 50,000 euros per megawatt because it was a single access tracker. And at the end of the day, if I look at the kind of O&M that was performed, it was not the best. But you couldn't change the O&M operator because the bank didn't want you to change it because they had built the technology. Therefore, I think that the other side of the coin is not how good is also being built, but also how is it going to be maintained. And the fact that we're getting that kind of money, but then they were concentrating into other countries because they needed to develop other countries, they were cashing in the money from the current O&Ms and then outsourcing it to local companies for them to oversee those type of assets, and therefore using the cash to build some new plants. So it's a combination of the two. If I had to say, luckily on my plants, with a couple of exceptions, because I know that out of a 90 megawatt portfolio, you will have a couple of black sheeps. I had to say that we've been lucky enough to select good EPC contractors, and which have installed good technology, and then we manage also to, if you see, make up for those lacking maintenance over time. And therefore, I do believe that these plants can last 20 to 30 years. I don't think we're going to get to 40. I think that if you want them to last as much, you probably need to do much more preventative or active maintenance with somebody that is on site almost every day to look at the things that change. But having said that, I haven't seen, at least in my portfolio, many plants falling apart. I know for a fact that there are a few, in Italy actually more than a few, but those are also those that have been financed with, leasing financing by entrepreneurs that had extra cash, so they wanted to build those 2, 3, 4, 5 megawatts on the back of their balance sheet, getting 95% financing from the bank, leaving it there, and who cares? Because obviously the returns were so high because these guys were EPC themselves, so have construction companies, and therefore had the opportunity to do it at a very low cost. So if they were looking at 20% IRRs, who cares if then my IRR goes down to 14 because the plant is not performing as it's supposed to be.
I'm going to, kind of go into some of the questions that have come in and kind of wrap that into some of the ones I'll ask. Some of the questions that are coming in, I'll just kind of run through these and I'll kind of pull a few together. how important is the variability of the O&M contractor? We'll get on to talk about O&M in a minute. Where specifically is the opportunity for the technology to improve and optimize? I guess what we're talking here is more kind of audit checks and what's there. Technology to improve, optimize in terms of something that's already built. I've always thought in terms of inspection, monitoring, diagnostics. How much you're optimizing what's already on site, and making sure that you're seeing the problems ahead of time. And which market will build most new capacity? So we're going to talk about the markets, and can new markets later on today. When we'll see subsidy freeze? Again, there's some of you are asking stuff about when are we going to get to grid parity? It's funny that question comes up at every event. I was in China last week for the big SNEC meeting, and I gave a couple of talks, and they were both completely different. One was on UK solar, and the other was on crystalline silicon manufacturing. And it's funny that both of the sessions, someone stood up and said, "When do we get to grid parity?" And I always thought that it's not so much about getting to grid parity. It's just when is my investment going to get return? When's a positive, an attractive return on investment? It's because you can't actually ever say grid parity is different. It's ultimately if I'm going to invest in that build, can we guarantee that someone's going to buy it and get the return on investment? And if I just go through some of the other questions here, I'm constantly frustrated chasing O&M and them failing to deliver. Al, did you write this? What is the appetite of investors here putting their money in growing Asian markets? Well, we'll kind of maybe just touch on that a little bit later, unless Japan and China want to join the EU when UK leaves. Realistic alternatives for market asset and risk management as the sector moves from fixed to grid pricing. So I guess that's kind of similar to the grid parity, but kind of different. Many traditional energy companies investing in digitizing their assets. How do the panel members see any parallels? I might actually bring that one in. What are the panel objectives in terms of project acquisition and jurisdictions for the coming years? Yeah, okay. So that's some of the questions coming in, and we're going to go out to the audience now who are actually starting to be a little bit more active.
One of my questions is around technical due diligence during secondary market transactions. A huge volume of assets changing hands certainly in the winter, a lot of it. The question is technical due diligence being done in secondary market transactions of enough detail and depth to protect the investments being made?
Most of us, I think, we were back in 2006, 2007 in Spain, Italy. So we've seen how the market started. And now we're talking, all of us, about the normality of running electroluminescence tests or having aerial kind of inspections, which were at the beginning, really in the early days, were not a completely common practice. And I kind of I want to strike a relatively positive note in terms of at the beginning, obviously all of us who were learning, there were many short-term investors. Now there is a prevalence, as your slide has seen, the top 6, for example, UK, but this is the same in most of European countries. There are long-term investors that are much more experienced. Clearly, the preference is when you build the asset is much easier because you do, and we built probably 75% of our assets. But when you buy the assets, now you have a number of tools that previously we didn't have. We have more awareness of the issues. I mean, PID started to come up at the kind of mid-late 2000, and it was completely new. Now it's a major awareness. So going forward, I'm relatively positive that, driven by the long-term investors and professional investors, we have the tools like the one you mentioned, and it becomes common practice. We do normally, every acquisition, we do kind of electroluminescence test, VI test that we normally, 6, 7 years ago, you were not going to do because you were driven by technical advisor, the bank, which wanted just a report. Yeah. So it was a different approach. There was the lenders market, that was driven by the banks. They wanted just a report, which was kind of a standard report, was not really fit for the owners. And now with the owners, most of us doing initially full equity, so we are not kind of driven by the banks, but driven by our requirements. So I think that is the way to kind of, during due diligence, it will all of us, I'm sure we do kind of scrutinize the asset from technical point of view very well. And just one point on terms of how do you optimize your existing, which we'll touch upon, and so I leave it to the others as well. We clearly, once you buy an existing asset, you have a limited set of things you can do, but still, with the points you mentioned, with the kind of the advances in the data mining and the data aggregation, which is something that was, again, not available a few years ago. And with the kind of synergies due to the contractual optimization because of the size, these are the two areas that have to be kind of elaborated and it's a tools for improvement.
So would you say that basically you've had to go through an almost in-house learning process of what that kind of recipe is? So when someone comes to you with a site,
yeah, not well. Obviously, we, as all of us, are kind of specialists, and particularly as we are specialists in solar. So obviously, I mean, we created more than 10 years experience in the market.
Yeah.
And therefore, when we are presented even problematic assets, we were not obviously scared, but we know what to do and how to address the issues if they are solvable.
It's actually fascinating to listen to that because...
Can I also add a little thing?
Yes, is it fascinating?
I think the majority of us sitting at this table have bought assets that were just recently built. So, I don't know, a month and a half after completion. So, spotting PID after 45 days of installation is not that easy because probably it's not there as yet. So, you get the book of who is the best panel manufacturer, and then according to the batches or whatever, historical data, you can look at that, but not always you have the data available. So if you buy after 2-3 years, obviously you run the thermography, you'll see the hotspots, you'll see whether there is PID, it's easier to spot. But if you bought it immediately after it was connected, it's not that easy because the technology, I mean, the equipment is brand spanking new, and therefore it looks fantastic.
Yeah, it's the reason why I think it's fascinating to hear is because, in terms of, you're basically sitting with the quality control metrics that if you fed that right back into, when the planners and the developers are gonna and the EPCs are gonna come in, then effectively that's what they need to be reading off.
Yeah.
And, it actually needs to go all the way down because that's where, and then the people that are gonna do the QC in the factories out in China, there's things there that you should be looking for other than I've got a lovely clean factory the day you came.
The information exchange between us as investors and EPCs is going to increase, especially because with a changing market, you probably, at least that's my impression, you need to communicate much earlier with them than in the past. In the past, the developer knew how big the cake would have been after the construction due to the fit, and now you basically decide together with the developer and the EPC how big the cake is going to be by offering a certain price for the tender and so on. So it's more, let's say, it's a closer cooperation in my opinion, that's going to happen.
Yeah, that's because literally you're getting involved earlier in the game. There was one question just over here.
It's not a question. It's only because I'm from SMA, and when we're speaking about quality of components, I have to mention something.
Sorry, SME, but
Some components is really
But do you know, I mean, to be honest, I mean, so please stay standing because now you've said that you're going to get a question. Every single company in the world says exactly that. So where is the third-party independent source you can go to in order to do the benchmarking?
There is not. There is not. There is a reputation in the market. I don't think there is. There could be a third party.
It's like that currency agencies are sincere when they talk about the cost of money. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately.
No, but
some of Aldo's investors may still believe that, but that's not how the world works.
it's not the machine itself, it's the service that you provide in 20-year life of the assets, which normally is well below standards in general in the market for inverters.
even there we can discuss this one.
Wish you'd never put your hand
That
up.
is I think that is the point.
But definitely, there is no independent third party. You only do ISO certification or whatever. But this is what also I was saying why I invite you coming to Kassel, because if you come to Kassel and see how we build the inverters, and then you compare it with some other manufacturers, you will see definitely, even when you are not an expert, some
Yeah.
differences.
Yeah, I guess it's probably, I'd say it's probably better to go and see a site that was built, you know, a bunch of sites that were built, you know, 5 or 10 years ago with inverters on site, but I get the point. Yep, we can just,
Yeah.
this is always waiting.
Thank you. Mark Rector in Equity in Portugal. We actually are at grid parity in Portugal. It depends on how you describe grid parity.
So why is
Is
no
it-
one building?
Sorry?
Why is no one building?
I'll get to that tomorrow.
Okay.
I'll save that for my presentation. But
Right.
so we're at grid parity at the wholesale market level at this time, because grid parity can also be compared to, you know, residential or commercial levels, et cetera. We're at the wholesale market level. We're able to do around 40 euros per megawatt hour and make money. Now that brings up the question. So you can sell into the market, or you can sell to a commercializer, right? You can do 1 to 10 years, or you can just kind of bet on the market, because the market's been, you know, going up and down. It's been going more up and down. So there's upside there. And the big question is, at least from my perspective, and it's a question to the investment community, what's your view on that? How are you going to deal with that? Are you thinking about this? What are the technology opportunities that you see in that as we go more and more towards a kind of a dynamic market pricing across Europe as well?
So in terms of answering your question, I think, first of all, Portugal is a brilliant market to invest. We have 50 megawatts in Portugal. It's brilliant. The experience, the business professionalism of society, how easy it is to do business in Portugal. So it's really standing alone compared with other countries. On top of that, we have investments in Portugal which are feed-in tariff. I think in terms of technology, and if you look in the design of some grid parity projects, I haven't seen yours, but in general, you know, the design of grid parity projects, in terms of panels, in terms of inverters, is not a big issue. In terms of structures, is not a big issue. Civils, you know, good construction companies can really do civils very well, so that is not an issue in itself. I think for investors like us, the big problem is how you can make it a bankable project. Investment full equity is easy, but the issue is that if you want to, you know, do some project finance or project bonds, there is a complexity based on the PPA that you get. Normally, companies like us, I think in general, we get PPAs which are long term. Moving to a mechanism in which you have a, you know, potentially a corporate PPA, or is a private counterpart, or the tenor of these PPAs are shorter, is an issue. Because at least our business model is, you know, we're long-term investors because it's 10 years, but at some point you need to sell, or, you know, you need to roll over the assets. Having a PPA of 5 years that you need to roll over every 5 years, which makes it very difficult for you to project finance, is an issue in itself. Obviously, we're moving into a financial solution. I think it's a financial solution. I don't think it's an issue with the assets or the construction itself. I think the technology has improved a lot. O&Ms are very competitive. EPCs are very competitive. I don't think that is a problem, really. It's really the bankability of the project.
Yeah, and I guess there's always kind of, you know, other issues about, you know, is the infrastructure there, so on and so forth. I'm going to just move away from Portugal a little bit, and you know, one of the questions that seems to get all the little ticks here is technology, and everyone's kind of mentioning technology. So I want to bring Mario you in this one. The technology to me is like is technology available to do the monitoring, do the you know, the data logging and whatever. And you know, where's that question gone now? It's gone off. It was something. We bring that question up, the big popular one in technology, because I want to read the question, because everyone seems to like it. Right, where specifically do you see the opportunity for technology to improve? So, what is currently now lacking in terms of, from a technical standpoint, from basically the O&Ms or the asset management side?
That's a good question. I think that the technology, like every technology, can only improve in, let's say, efficiency, in performance. Besides that, I don't see any big steps happening. I think it's going to be an incremental increase. That's probably something that Aldous is missing, but I don't think that there will happen anything else. So slight increases.
So, but compared to, I mean, there's obviously more technology being used on monitoring now than there was 10 years ago. I mean, you have drones.
Yes, you can. Yes, but they are again incremental. You can detect earlier what's going wrong. But I mean, there is no big, let's say, evolution in that. And
Okay, so another way of framing the question is, what would you like to, if you had a little black box right now, you pressed a button and it gave you the answer to something, what would it be?
I'm really not focused that much on technology. I think that the issues we've discussed before are much bigger than let's say getting 2% more from a plant. It's good to know once you've built a plant. Of course, you want to maximize it, but besides that, I mean, it's installing more capacity, having the market evolving, and the technology itself for me is mature enough and is good enough.
Well,
just because I'm an engineer as a background, and I did my thesis in electrical engineering in solar, 1997. And indeed, as Mario was saying, the silicon technology was there. The efficiency was around 10%. Yeah. Now it's 20, so it took 20 years to get twice. I don't think it will be a big leap unless we change technology. So it will be incremental. On the technology, that's not we have to expect. I mean, it will go to 25, 30%. Yeah. There are some limits, physical limits. But yeah, the monitoring, it will be incremental as well. But
yes.
This is a real hot topic because it gives you the opportunity to manage the data mining. It's giving you the opportunity to increase the availability even by kind of a 0.5%, which makes the difference when we're talking about long-term gains. And the importance of monitoring, I think, is seen in the M&A activities. I mean, we have here in Axel has been bought, GPM has been bought, Skytron has been. Yep. So it's something that is a focus. How can improve? It's marginal. I mean, it's really increase the availability, or it is really the trend, which is not yet, but it will come, is the predictive. The kind of the predictive maintenance,
yes,
where
yes.
From certain trends and certain temperatures, you can start kind of spotting a potential issue. But that is something will improve, again, availability, but availability is already quite high, so you can improve by kind of 0.5, 1%. But it's something that is very interesting and it was not available a few years ago. I think that was
Can I
Yeah,
finally
sure.
add, there's going to be a difference in the sense that if you improve the performance of a plant that has been feed-in tariffed, the actual improvement in the economy of your returns is actually minimal. If you do it on a grid parity type of projects, the improvement will play a bigger role in that respect. In the sense that obviously when 75, 80% of your revenues, like in Italy, back the plants are coming from feed-in tariff, the fact that you do a 0.5% more, it's not going to change your business plan. But when you do it on a grid parity basis, and instead of gaining 0.5%, you lose 3%, that's going to make a big difference. So I think that the improvements that we're going to have to see are much more, and we're going to see them more when the grid parity market is going to start than today, because there is not that strong attention today as yet, because still, even if you're not performing 100% you were supposed to be, you're still making your returns. Yeah, well, nobody's going to blame you for 0.5 point of IRR less.
Let me add. So I think the question was purely on technology improvement. I haven't heard anything yet. So let me give my 2 pence comment here. I think the key changes will come from inverters. So if you look at the panels, if you look at the technology of panels and the improvement over the time has been significant over time. But if you look at where the savings will come, I believe it's from inverters. So if you look, you compare central inverters from string inverters. Personally, I prefer central inverters. They have proven to be more reliable, easier to maintain, and they last more than 20 years. So central inverters, the experience is very good for industrial scale solar. The issue with inverters is the most, so people normally forget about inverters, but the inverters is the most important component of a solar plant, because the inverter is the brain of the plant. So we're moving to the Internet of Things, and the only device in the plant that can actually know what's going on is the inverter. So, and people normally forget about inverters. What I see in the inverter is, if you look at a company like SMA or CACO, whoever, really, I think these companies are moving more and more into being a software company. So they provide the software, and they have an IP on that software. But really, if you look at the components of that inverter, for example, we did an analysis ourselves. One of the inverters that we have, 95% of the components were ABB. So it was easier for us to go to ABB and reproduce the inverter than going to the inverter manufacturer that is charging you a premium and the service is a piece of shit. So really, that is the future. If someone is able to build an inverter which you take off the shelf, which costs you nothing, and thinking about building projects, for example, in Africa, that the components are readily available going anywhere, that is a game changer. And this is where the technology has to go. And then you have companies like SMA that they will provide, the IGBT, which you can do in Taiwan anyway, plus the software. And that is the game changer. You convert these companies into software companies, and then you can integrate the whole inverter maintenance into the O&M.
Yeah.
And that is a game changer.
Yeah, actually, it does go one step beyond that, because the modules are actually getting smarter now with regards software. And I think over the next few years, you're going to see much more interaction between the inverter and optimizing the module and the cells. That's beginning to change, as opposed to just you plug it into the inverter. Any other questions here?
Ronan from QS Energy, independent software vendor. Talking about software and monitoring, it's good to have a panel of asset owners. How many of you have gone to the strategy of looking at independent monitoring, because you are acquiring so many different portfolios that have different data acquisition system, inverters, different technologies and manufacturers? How many of you, or what is the importance you see coming in the future of having a strategy?
No, I'll give you two perspectives, right? The investor and the asset manager. As an investor, I frankly disagree with most of the messages here, and at the risk of being the difficult one, I think I'm really against this climate of relaxation on the existing assets or what's been already built. Of course, there's two types of improvements on new technology, so hopefully the new technology will be much better than what we have today, which, not being an engineer, I can tell you that it's not satisfactory, I believe. And then when it comes instead to the existing technology, it could do much more. It could do. You just compare the theoretical yield of an asset on any single day and what comes out of the monitoring, and it's always suboptimal. The issue is that the entire industry relaxed themselves on a banking case that was serving the debts, that was paying the dividends, that was paying the O&M, and everybody was happy. But it's suboptimal. It's just a waste. And it takes a lot of effort and time and so sort of to chase the theoretical limits, but has to be done. And when you talk to...
How suboptimal?
Well, depending on the markets, we have experienced that the suboptimal could be in between, 5 to 15%. To me, that's a lot in terms of percentages. And it might depend on a lot of things, even availability. Now, we had a gentleman from SMA, which is a manufacturer of good technology with a good name, completely screwed and ruined by a very poor service aftermarket, and that doesn't do well to themselves, but that doesn't do well also to asset owners. And so people actually have then to go and reinvent the management of the inverters and go in as much into designing softwares together with other partners. Now, the perspective of the asset manager instead is being also on top of Wise Energy, which has, say, 2 gigawatts of data from assets generated over the last 5 to 10 years. The information is now developing, is definitely getting better. It's always been key. So Wise Energy at the very beginning started to design its own monitoring system because what was on the market wasn't available. And because, like in every other sector, information is key. And when you talk to hedge funds, for example, they trade based on information. And so we actually wanted to develop that. And after a few years of painful software development efforts, we actually found that the industry finally started to have better products out there. And so now we are partnering up with other software houses who have developed better products. So there's definitely improvements there. And probably at some point there would be an integration with the inverters, which definitely are the brain of the solar plants. And maybe there will be some more integration in that area. I hope there will be.
Yeah.
Sorry, just a comment there. I think that you're focusing a lot on hardware, which I'm sure is correct in some cases. I think in other cases also, though, even though the solar sector is supposedly mature, thank you. Even though the solar sector is supposed to be mature, I think it's just come out of its, kind of first growth phase. And we're now entering a kind of a second growth phase and a maturity period. What we see is that even at the design level, where engineers have designed systems, a lot of mistakes have been made previously in the ramp up to what we now call a more mature market. So I think from an asset manager point of view, apart from the hardware side, there are opportunities for you to optimize just by going back, doing tests and looking at, how was this system designed and is this optimized, right? How are the voltages working, between the panels and the inverters. Yeah. And we've seen a lot of examples there where you can do, 5-10% of production increase with very little investment. So I think that may be another suggestion in terms of, how can you optimize things that perhaps have not been, ideally designed to start with.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. So I'm just going to flip back to some of the other questions that are coming in here. How important is the variability of the O&M contractor? Not that that's a loaded question at all. All the questions on regards markets and future, we're going to be having other sessions on what's going to happen in the future in different markets. So I'm going to park them all to one side at the moment. And let's have a look at some of the other burning questions. Again, if anyone wants to put their hand up and ask a question that they've not seen, or you don't like this kind of electronic way of doing it, then please, because we've only got 10 minutes left. So we've kind of touched on largely a bunch of things related to built assets and monitoring them. I'm going to come back to, because a few of you have kind of spoken about, what that whole process looks like going forward. And, I guess it is because as we move towards a situation where everything has to be absolutely spot on from the start, then it becomes a different, altogether different picture. It's a different, if you're getting together with a bunch of developers, you're involved in the capital up front that is building that plant. You literally can define everything. You have to define everything much better. And, if you kind of bring in storage to that whole picture as well, then, there's absolutely no way that other people are just going to, a property developer is going to get into solar and storage, subsidy free and build 500 megawatts and put it on the market. That old kind of method that, one day you're building apartment blocks and the next minute you're, developing solar farms. That's gone. So what does that look like in 3 or 4 years' time? And I guess because all the things I've spoken about, all these problems, then it's the opportunity to get that whole thing working in a completely different way. So again, I just want to kind of leave that as I'm going to, let's run along that. What does we've gone through, we've sorted out all these problems. What does that environment look like? And what needs to change aside from the access to finance, how does the whole thing work? How you guaranteed income? What does it look like, the interaction between the supply side, the O&M, data management, component quality? What does it look like in 2 or 3 years' time when you're having to get in there early and be involved more in the selection of all the components and who's doing what and where? And Federico, if we can start with you and then we can just work and we're going to finish on that question. I
think many of you will agree with the fact that obviously that started as a financial business for some financial players like us is turning it to be an industrial business with a much more utility cut than had before. That means that we as players need to skill up and start hiring people that can do, let's say, design, that can do development, that can actively monitor the plants, and maybe you will insource the majority of your O&M because you think you're going to do it better internally than externally, and just outsource the things that you think are no added value or that somebody else can do better than you, and therefore learn from them and then insource them farther on. So that's, I think, the kind of change we're going to see in the next years, especially when we see the fact that we will play also the aggregation game, and therefore our gigawatt worldwide will become 2 gigawatts in 5 years, and then maybe 5 gigawatts in 10 years, and so on and so forth. So I think that's the kind of trend that we're going to see in the solar market. But not only in that one, I think that the renewable energy market is playing that kind of game, not only on this asset class, but also on the other ones, because the cowboys that in Italy and Spain started developing plants as much as some others that did here in the UK and did that could do it because obviously there was a feed-in tariff, so the design was not that important at that point in time. The important thing was to throw the panels out there and sell them and leverage on the opportunity. The market becomes challenging and complicated, the most you need to do every single phase spot on, as you were saying, although nothing is ever spot on, as you might imagine, and it will be difficult to convince some of the investors to invest in development, and therefore you need to create probably a new form of, let's say, vehicle or something that has got that kind of cut, because the previous investor wants to continue investing their money and adding more risk, because this is the financial investor world. It's kind of unique. And then, Aldo, that you do it on a daily basis, and I think all of us do it on a daily basis. Investors want returns, and stability and no risk. They don't want to see risk anywhere. Yeah. So, and that's virtually impossible to sell. Although we try our best to tell them, look, out of the 100,000 million risks that you might have, I reduce them to 3, yeah? And I know how to manage them. That's the kind of job. So we need to also convince them in the near future that they will have this type of same risk because we will allocate it better than others can do. However, the fact that you are adding risk with the development and throwing away money, you need to increase the return. That's going to be the challenge.
Okay. Giovanni?
Yeah, I think developing on what Federico said, which is certainly fully agree, is if we look at the new world and we look at the value chain, indeed, we will see the larger player that will play on the global, European, in this case, and global stage. So you will need in-house resources to cover most of the value chain. Access to the development, yes, indeed. It is much more riskier, so difficult to finance, but yeah, accessing the assets globally is becoming more complex. And go all the way the value chain, all to asset management, which probably all of us have now internalized, and the O&M, which is, I think, another trend in sourcing more than outsourcing, but going also up to the power trading, because then is what will happen. If unless we have a PPA providers that and there is a competitive market with few providers globally, or at least a Europe level, that provide long-term PPAs, and to my knowledge there are 1 or 2 at the moment. You have to have expertise in-house to manage a more complex world, which is a different world, which is that maximize your energy trading if possible. That is clashes with the investors, obviously, because they don't want to have a merchant risk. So you have to find the right balance with the PPAs providers, yeah, and adding a little bit of more value with and leaving a little bit of flexibility on your power purchase.
It's almost a more intelligent company that's vertically integrated in terms of its know-how, and then applying that at the start, that we just simply haven't needed it up until now. Correct, yeah. And then, a lot of the questions, you can almost see having the inverter, all the knowledge that you need to make sure that the initial decision is as risk-free as possible. Mario, your thoughts?
I couldn't agree more with what has been already said. One thing I would like to point out, especially in the last part, let's say, of the value chain, when it comes up to selling the energy, we've been talking about data before, data mining, knowing the data and collecting them. And actually, I think this is where you can extract the most profit if you manage it well, because this is something that will be unique for asset owners. And actually, that's why I think it's absolutely important to focus on the management of this information, but not only for improving the performance of the plant, but also for, let's say, creating value and getting knowledge on the energy market.
Perfect. Jordi, in terms of, and obviously a lot's focused here on solar, but I mean, has wind gone through this, or is
Yeah, it means I think it's extending on what Federico was saying. So clearly there is a consolidation of the market. So if you look in 3 years' time, clearly asset owners there will be less and bigger. O&M providers will be less and bigger. You see already a big consolidation in the solar market for O&M. O&M will take more value chain from inverter manufacturers. That is a given. They provide better service, so they will take service level 1, 2, or even more for inverters. And what I see, if you compare with wind, wind has gone through a big consolidation. So now it's a very mature industry. And if you look solar, we're going through the same trend. I think we're 2-3 years behind it, but now there are good European standards on PV, O&M services in construction of plants. Service level agreements now are very clear and well defined, and actually O&M providers can really comply with the service level agreements. In solar, traditionally, if you had one string down, people didn't bother much. But now with the IT and Internet of Things, you can actually benchmark your plan with competitors, so you can actually go really to the penny on improvement of performance of the plant. So I would say if you compare with wind, we are indeed 3 years behind, but I think solar is catching up very quickly. To be honest, in terms of the quality of the service that you are getting now with some of the consolidated players.
Okay, great. And Aldo, the last comments of the panel, so make them good.
No, I'll,
Make them positive.
Please disagree.
As opposed to the starting ones.
No, the thing is, I'll continue a little bit on this note, because if you're asking what asset owners want, you have to appreciate also that there is little intention of just relying on what we have been told. And so a fixation, for example, of us has always been the independent access to data. So we go as far as designing and assembling and installing our own proprietary SCADA, so that we read the information before we are told by the O&M operator that there probably is a problem, that the plant goes absolutely fine. And it is important, actually, the industry appreciates that ultimately in efficient markets, the transparent approach is what works best for everybody. So if there was also a positive and a proactive approach from the industry in those that design the assets and then install the assets and maintain the assets, to actually give access to this information in full transparency, there will be also the creation of this circle of trust that ultimately should lead to a better kind of relationship, a symbiotic relationship between asset owners and the industry in the long run. Hopefully this is positive enough.
Excellent. Stop there. Appreciate it. Just before you go, please, if you'd like to just thank our panel for their hour's contribution.